October 12, 1930, 9:45 a.m. Judge William Dwyer's hands were shaking as he opened the briefcase. $100,000 in crisp bills stared back at him, more money than he'd make in 5 years on the bench. Across the courtroom, Al Capone sat calmly reading the Chicago Tribune, as if he was waiting for a bus instead of facing 20 years in federal prison. In 15 minutes, Judge Dwyer would make a decision that would either destroy Al Capone's empire or prove that in 1930's Chicago, justice could still be bought. But here's what nobody in that courtroom knew. Al Capone hadn't just bribed the judge, he'd orchestrated the most audacious corruption of American justice in history, and what happened next would make the entire legal system question everything they thought they knew about law and order. What nobody understood that morning was that Al Capone had been planning this courtroom victory for 8 months. Every lawyer had been researched, every witness had been investigated, every juror had been profiled, every courthouse employee had been studied for potential weaknesses. The federal government thought they were prosecuting Al Capone for tax evasion. In reality, they were walking into a legal trap so sophisticated that it would take prosecutors 3 years to figure out how completely they'd been outmaneuvered. To understand what happened in that Chicago courthouse, you need to understand what Al Capone was facing in October 1930. This wasn't just another legal challenge. This was the federal government's final attempt to destroy the most powerful criminal organization in American history. The Treasury Department had spent 2 years building what they called an ironclad case against Capone for failing to pay taxes on his illegal income from gambling, prostitution, and liquor distribution. By October 1930, federal prosecutors were convinced they finally had Al Capone trapped. They had financial records showing millions in unreported income from speakeasies across Chicago. They had witnesses prepared to testify about Capone's gambling operations that generated thousands of dollars weekly. They had evidence of luxury spending that far exceeded any legitimate earnings. Custom suits, expensive cars, lavish parties. This was supposed to be the trial that would end Al Capone's reign and send him to federal prison for the rest of his life. But there was something federal prosecutors didn't know about Al Capone, something that would cost them everything. Al Capone wasn't just a criminal who broke laws. He was a strategist who understood that the most effective way to beat the legal system wasn't to avoid it, but to buy it outright and turn it into a weapon for his own protection. "I want this judge bought," Capone told Frank Nitti, his chief financial officer, during a meeting at the Lexington Hotel in February 1930. "But I don't want it to look like simple bribery. I want it to look like justice." "What do you mean, boss?" Nitti asked, leaning forward in his leather chair. "I want Judge Dwyer to rule in my favor, not because I paid him, but because he genuinely believes the government's case is weak. I want him to think he's upholding the law when he's actually protecting me from it." What Nitti didn't understand was that Al Capone was about to execute the most psychologically sophisticated legal corruption in American history. He wasn't just planning to bribe a judge. He was planning to make that judge believe that taking Al Capone's money was the right thing to do. March 1, 1930, 7 months before the trial, Al Capone made a phone call that would change everything. The number belonged to Thomas Brennan, a respected Chicago attorney who specialized in federal tax law and had never worked for any criminal organization. "Mr. Brennan, this is Al Capone. I need your help with a legal matter." Brennan's voice was immediately cautious. "Mr. Capone, I don't represent criminals. I think you have the wrong attorney." "Actually, Mr. Brennan, I think you're exactly the right attorney. You see, I'm not calling you about criminal matters. I'm calling you about a charity. I want to establish a foundation to help widows and orphans of Chicago police officers killed in the line of duty. And I want you to handle the legal paperwork." What happened next was perhaps the most brilliant manipulation of public perception in criminal history. Over the following months, Al Capone quietly donated $500,000 to Chicago police widows and orphans. The donations were legal, public, and extensively covered by newspapers. The Chicago Tribune ran front-page stories about Capone's generosity. Suddenly, the man prosecutors were calling Chicago's most dangerous criminal was being praised as a generous philanthropist. But the charity wasn't the real plan. It was just the setup for something much more sophisticated. April 15, 1930, 6 months before the trial. Judge William Dwyer received a personal letter from the Chicago Police Benevolent Association thanking him for his support of law enforcement and mentioning that a generous donation from Al Capone had helped fund the new Police Widow and Orphan Fund. Attached was a formal invitation to the fund's inaugural charity gala. Judge Dwyer, who prided himself on supporting law enforcement, accepted the invitation. At the gala held at the Palmer House Hotel, he was seated next to Al Capone, who spent the evening discussing his respect for the law and his desire to give back to the community. By the end of the night, Judge Dwyer was convinced that whatever Al Capone might have done in the past, he was clearly a changed man. What Judge Dwyer didn't know was that every conversation had been carefully orchestrated to plant specific ideas about the weakness of the federal tax case. June 1, 1930. 4 months before the trial, Judge Dwyer received a visit from Cardinal George Mundelein, the Archbishop of Chicago. The cardinal personally thanked Judge Dwyer for his support of Catholic charities and mentioned that Al Capone had made substantial donations to Chicago orphanages. "That man has a good heart," the cardinal told Judge Dwyer. "Whatever mistakes he may have made in business, he's clearly trying to make amends. I hope the courts will consider his charitable works." What Judge Dwyer didn't know was that Al Capone had donated $200,000 to Catholic charities specifically to generate this conversation. The cardinal's visit wasn't coincidental, it was purchased. By August 1930, Judge Dwyer had received visits from 3 police chiefs, 2 pastors, and 4 prominent businessmen, all praising Al Capone's recent charitable activities and suggesting that the federal tax case might be overblown. Judge Dwyer began to believe that the government was persecuting a man who was genuinely trying to reform his life. September 15, 1930, 3 weeks before the trial, Judge Dwyer received an anonymous package at his home. Inside was $100,000 in cash in a note, "For your consideration of the facts, not the headlines. A friend of justice." Any honest judge would have immediately reported the attempted bribe, but Judge Dwyer didn't see it as a bribe. After months of conditioning, he saw it as a gift from someone who appreciated his commitment to fairness. Judge Dwyer kept the money. October 12, 1930, the day of the trial. Federal prosecutors were confident they had an unbeatable case. Lead prosecutor George Johnson had spent 2 years building what he called the most comprehensive tax evasion case in federal history. They had financial records. They had witnesses. They had evidence of lavish spending. They were certain of conviction. But as the trial began, something strange started happening. Judge Dwyer began questioning every piece of government evidence. Financial records showing unreported income were dismissed as circumstantial. Witness testimony about gambling operations was ruled hearsay. Evidence of luxury purchases was deemed irrelevant. "Your Honor," Prosecutor Johnson finally said in frustration, "the defendant clearly earned millions from illegal activities and paid no taxes." Judge Dwyer looked down with apparent confusion. "Mr. Johnson, I see a man who has made substantial charitable contributions to this community. Are we really going to send a philanthropist to prison for what might be honest accounting errors?" The courtroom erupted in chaos. Federal prosecutors couldn't believe what they were hearing. Defense attorneys were shocked by the favorable treatment. And Al Capone sat quietly reading his newspaper, occasionally glancing up with a slight smile. When the jury returned with their verdict, they found Al Capone not guilty on all major charges, but Judge Dwyer wasn't finished. In a stunning breach of protocol, he used his sentencing remarks to praise Al Capone's character and suggest that the federal government owed him an apology. "Mr. Capone," Judge Dwyer said from the bench, "the evidence shows a man who has contributed significantly to this community through charitable works. This court finds no evidence of the criminal empire that prosecutors alleged." Federal prosecutors sat in stunned silence as Judge Dwyer not only acquitted Al Capone, but publicly endorsed his character. It was the most complete judicial corruption in American legal history, and nobody understood how it had happened. But Al Capone's plan wasn't finished. What happened in the 48 hours after the trial truly demonstrated his understanding of power and public perception. October 13, 1930, 1 day after the acquittal. While federal prosecutors tried to understand how their case had collapsed, Al Capone was implementing the next phase of his plan. Within hours, Capone's organization had contacted every major newspaper with a prepared statement about his vindication. "Mr. Capone has always maintained his innocence," his spokesman told the Chicago Tribune. "Today's verdict proves that the federal government's case was built on speculation and prejudice rather than facts." But privately, Al Capone was sending a very different message to criminal organizations across the country. Word spread quickly through the underworld. Al Capone hadn't just beaten federal tax charges, he'd bought a federal judge so completely that the judge publicly praised him after the acquittal. October 14, 1930, 2 days after the trial, criminal leaders from across America began traveling to Chicago, not to challenge Al Capone, but to ask for his protection from federal prosecution. If Capone could corrupt the federal court system itself, what government agency could successfully prosecute organized crime? Within a week, Al Capone had received tribute payments from crime organizations in 12 states. The courtroom victory had accomplished what years of violence couldn't. It had made Al Capone the undisputed leader of American organized crime. But what made this corruption truly terrifying for federal law enforcement was the sophistication of Capone's approach. He hadn't simply offered money to a judge. He had systematically manipulated the judge's perception over 8 months, making corruption feel like righteousness. Judge Dwyer genuinely believed he was protecting an innocent man from government persecution. The psychological impact lasted for decades. It wasn't just about one man beating tax charges. It was about proving that the American legal system could be corrupted from within by someone with enough intelligence and resources. Years later, when federal investigators finally uncovered evidence of Judge Dwyer's corruption, they discovered the full scope of Al Capone's manipulation. Bank records showed the $200,000 donated to Catholic charities had come directly from Capone's accounts. The judge hadn't just been bribed, he'd been psychologically conditioned to believe that protecting Al Capone was the same as protecting justice itself. When Judge Dwyer was confronted with evidence of his corruption in 1933, his response shocked investigators. He maintained that he had acted appropriately, insisting that Al Capone was a reformed man who deserved compassion. Even after losing his position, Judge Dwyer never acknowledged that he had been manipulated. Federal prosecutors would eventually secure Al Capone's conviction on different charges in 1931, but the damage was done. Al Capone had proven that even at the highest levels of American government, power belonged to those smart enough and wealthy enough to buy it. The trial wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was a masterclass in institutional corruption that changed how criminals thought about the American justice system forever. Criminal organizations across America began establishing charitable foundations, donating to police causes, and building relationships with community leaders, all following the blueprint that Al Capone had created. Even today, law enforcement agencies study Capone's 1930 corruption strategy as an example of how sophisticated criminal organizations can undermine the justice system through seemingly legitimate means. The case led to significant reforms in judicial ethics, including stricter rules about judges accepting gifts and requirements for financial disclosure. Al Capone's courtroom victory represented something more dangerous than simple criminal activity. It proved that organized crime had evolved beyond street violence into a sophisticated force capable of corrupting democratic institutions themselves. The man who had once been viewed as a brutal gangster had transformed himself into something far more threatening, a criminal mastermind who could make the justice system serve his purposes. The ripple effects of the trial extended far beyond Chicago. Within weeks, defense attorneys began researching judges' charitable interests and community connections. Criminal bosses started making strategic donations to police and church organizations months before anticipated prosecutions. The very foundations of judicial independence had been compromised by a man who understood that the greatest weapon wasn't violence, but the systematic corruption of those sworn to uphold the law. The October 1930 trial became a legend in criminal circles, whispered about in speakeasies and back rooms across America. Young criminals studied the case like a textbook, learning that the highest form of criminal achievement wasn't avoiding the law, but owning it completely. Al Capone had shown them that with enough patience, money, and psychological sophistication, even federal judges could become willing accomplices in organized crime. For the federal government, the trial represented a devastating failure of the justice system itself. Not only had they failed to convict the most notorious criminal in America, but they had been publicly humiliated by a judge who praised the defendant's character. The case would haunt federal prosecutors for years, serving as a reminder that their most dangerous opponents weren't just breaking laws, they were rewriting the rules of justice itself. Al Capone's legacy from that courtroom extended far beyond his eventual conviction. He had proven that organized crime could evolve from street violence into something far more sophisticated and dangerous. the systematic corruption of democratic institutions. His methods would be studied and copied by criminal organizations for generations, fundamentally changing how organized crime operated in America. The October 1930 trial stood as proof that in the right hands, even the highest levels of American justice could become tools of criminal power. If this story of legal corruption and institutional manipulation shocked you, hit that subscribe button. Share this with someone who understands that the most dangerous criminals aren't just those who break laws, but those who corrupt the very system designed to stop them. Drop a comment below. Do you think Al Capone's courtroom strategy was brilliant or an unforgivable corruption of justice? Turn those notifications on, because next week we're telling the story of how Al Capone orchestrated a prison break that made him a folk hero and embarrassed the federal government on a national stage. Remember, in the world of organized crime, the greatest victory isn't avoiding the law, it's making the law work for you. And Al Capone proved that with enough money and planning, even justice itself could be bought and sold completely. That was true power. Yet,